Are you ready to get nuked? I'm not.
I don't want to.
No, I don't think anybody wants to be nuked. And so we'll look into what's going to happen there. Are we all going to get nuked by Joe Biden and Putin before Donald Trump gets his second term in? Let's find out. But first, I'll take us through what's going to potentially happen, or at least how it's shaping up with Donald Trump's foreign policy and some of his media policies that are going to be happening as soon as he gets in. And then we'll see how they might try and scupper all of that. First, though, we have a new channel on YouTube called Lotus Eaters Daily. It is not a replacement of the podcast channel on YouTube. It is something to go alongside it. This is going to be shorter, more precise content, a bit more fun, very, very focused, where we look at one or two articles, go through it, a bit like This Week in Stupid, except I'm not allowed to say it is This Week in Stupid. So it's going to be a bit like it, but not. Okay, with that, let's get into it. So first of all, one of the funniest things that's happened since Donald Trump has become president-elect again is that it seems like the media is going to roll over and capitulate this time, mainly because I would imagine that over the past 4 years their viewership has been absolutely tanking, because since Donald Trump left office peacefully, I might add, their viewership has tanked.
Yeah,
because they've had no one to talk about. So it seems that they're going to try and make peace with him for the time being, and people were getting very, very annoyed with, for instance, MSNBC's anchors, Joe Scarborough and Mika, Polish name, the fact that they went to Mar-a-Lago recently so that, as they say in this clip, they could open dialogue.
You mean have a conversation?
Yeah. Have a conversation. Because, we've got family members and friends who we don't always have to agree with. So why can't it be the same with the president? Say the people who, for decades at this point, have been absolutely furious at the idea of having to even exist on the same planet as people that they disagree with. They say, who cut off all of this communication? Why can't we have a dialogue anymore? Well, that's your fault. You guys did that.
It's like someone punching you in the face and said, wow, whoever did that is terrible.
But what it shows is weakness. They are capitulating somewhat, at least for now.
They're bending the knee to America's new president. I nearly said monarch.
It certainly looks that way. If only America could do with one of those. Although ours is no help at the moment, certainly. But Foreign Policy have been doing quite a few articles talking about what's going to be happening with Donald Trump's foreign policy, and I thought it would be interesting to look through what they're saying here. So obviously the biggest thing that people are talking about regarding his trade policy is that he has been threatening duties and tariffs on foreign countries as a way to try and generate new revenue into the country while being able to put the taxes down, and also to try and encourage greater industry, because of course a lot of American industry has been offshored to places like China. That's not actually a good thing. Even if you believe in the global economy, it's not actually a good thing for you as a nation to not have your own industries produce anything.
It is worth pointing out, I'm about as free market as it gets, and certain industries that are important to defence should be protected, like producing your own steel is important. Producing your own munitions is important. Producing your own food, your own fuel. These sorts of things are important to have domestically. As Britain learned in the two world wars, if you're too overly reliant on imports, it can put you in a vulnerable position, which makes you susceptible to foreign influence. And
even more recently than the second two world wars is 2022, the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, Russia cutting off the taps into Europe, increased a lot of prices for energy over here because we are incredibly reliant on imports from Russia.
And so I think it makes sense to favour certain industries that are essential to the preservation of the nation state. Pardon you.
Excuse me, this thing's already taking its toll on me. But yeah, he's trying to potentially put on a tariff as high as 60% on all goods in China.
That's huge. That's going to...
And perhaps it says 20% on everything from everywhere else.
If you can humour a very slight tangent, China's in massive danger of falling into the middle income trap, that they're never going to catch up to developed Western economies. And actually, they're going to have to go for a period of reorganising how their local government and their central government are actually financed, because they've relied on financing it through loans based on assets. And obviously, you can only do that for a certain amount of time before you've got to pay up. And so they've got to restructure their entire economic system and also remain competitive with Western powers at the same time as Donald Trump potentially introducing 60% tariffs. So that's basically going to, take a match to the paper tiger that is China, isn't it?
It certainly could. Well, some people are also suggesting, and I think this is probably true, that for maybe China and maybe a lot of the other countries that America trades with, it might just be being used as a bargaining chip.
I think that's most likely,
rates.
Because that would be just as potentially destructive to America, that's still quite dependent on Chinese imports.
It would be a hell of a shock to the economy if it were
would,
to happen all at once. Mm-hmm. But it would fit in with Donald Trump's typical diplomatic methods, as we saw in his first term, which was basically threaten the absolute worst to try and get your opponent to back down.
Some might say it is the art of the deal.
Some might say indeed. But one of the ways that they're saying that he might be able to do this, which is that they go over a load of the different technical ways that he could use existing legislation or declare national economic emergencies on particular products. They're also pointing out he could just go all the way back to the 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which made the Great Depression worse. But still, that's still on the books. And apparently Section 338 of Smoot-Hawley would allow the president, with only a cursory determination and with unilateral authority, to slap tariffs of up to 50% on goods from any country, that treat the United States unfairly or restrict US goods in any way. If the harms continue, Section 338 allows the president to prohibit the import of those goods altogether.
That's quite a powerful string to his bow, isn't it?
It certainly is, but again, I imagine he's mostly going to be using it as a negotiating and bargaining tool.
Because I don't think it's in either country's interest to impede trade in that way.
But either way, with the ongoing wars that are happening right now, particularly Ukraine and Russia, which America is using Ukraine or has been using Ukraine for a while as a go-between, as a bit of a proxy for an ongoing war, economic and otherwise, with Russia. Russia, as part of BRICS, is trying to engineer its own way to escape the global economic system that exists right now and present its own alternatives, mainly to what people have deemed, and it is the stupidest term, the global south, which means basically non-European and non-Anglo-Sphere
basically countries that are south of the equator. But there will always be a market for Russian goods because, say you're Somalia, it's not like the United States is chomping at the bit to have them as an ally. And so, and they're very poor. They don't really care about diplomacy when they're living hand to mouth and at a pretty low standard of living. And so they will be willing to buy Russian oil and things like that. And there will always be countries like this in the world. So the United States can't corner Russia because there's always a market for goods.
Yeah, and they have always been, since their own industrial surge in the early 20th century, a huge manufacturing power as well. But this was BRICS Summit 2024, I think last month, in October. And it was held in Kazan. And in it, Russia was trying to present a few new ways of establishing its own dominance in the global economy away from the American system.
I think also it being held in Kazan in Russia is quite significant because it shows that Russia is the central power. And I think that were the BRICS group quite image conscious, they would have made sure it would have been somewhere else. And the fact they held it in Russia is making a statement all on its own that it's a parallel economy to that of the United States and their global empire.
But what they're trying to present is what's called BRICS Bridge for the moment, which is going to basically be an alternative to SWIFT. It's a project that its goal is getting rid of intermediaries for international transactions made with central bank digital currencies. These systems allow payments to make a direct trip between, say, for instance, Indian and Brazilian banks without having to go through an American intermediary. The benefits of financial transactions do not need to make a stopover or go through SWIFT, the Western-controlled global payment system between banks, which Russia is still currently cut off from. as well. Bypassing Western financial channels also offers a layer of protection against sanctions from G7 countries and their allies, since in most cases these sanctions only bite if sanctioned countries' firms use Western currencies or have ties to the G7 economies. A final advantage of BRICS has to do with Bridge has to do with its digital nature. BRICS central banks could easily program a digital mechanism so that it blocks transactions that run counter to their interests or in extreme scenarios restricts Western access to their market. So this is all part of what Dan has been talking about. We were living in the multipolar world where America was the one big global superpower. Russia, this is another huge way of trying to step outside of America's shadow and establish itself as the main competing global superpower. Because there's also the threat of China, but as you've mentioned, China seems to present more of a paper tiger, whereas Russia is making moves.
They're a lot more. I mean, both the Chinese and the Russians are pretty savvy diplomatically, and I think that they're going to be more of a diplomatic threat than an economic one potentially, although the Chinese economy obviously very big, but compared to alliance between North America and Europe, I think that the economy would outshine. But I also think that outside of the United States, more competition will actually be good for those countries. So if you're, say, living in Europe, this competition might actually potentially be good because the United States will want to be more favourable to their client states, basically, because they won't want to lose them to the competing group.
They don't want most of Europe to come under the Russian sphere of influence, which is one of the main reasons that they've been using Ukraine as the proxy for a war against Russia, because I think they worry if Russia shows some kind of dominance in it, then it would perhaps mean that, again, America looks weak on the world stage. Therefore, maybe some European countries, some who have shown a little bit of sympathy towards Russia, maybe might go over that way instead.
But I personally don't see many of the European countries that have been big backers of Ukraine moving away from the United States. For example, Britain.
Not without massive regime.
No. I think Britain's going to be very much pegged, and a lot of other countries as well, to the United States. And the US is going to be the main loser if this does continue gaining traction.
Yeah, and recently I think, wasn't there a reassertion of Britain's support of Ukraine, as long as it takes, again, was reasserted whilst we're trying to destroy the Kulak class so that we can make up tiny holes in the budget, which is a huge, gigantic black hole of money. So glad to know that we need to destroy the farms whilst we're also throwing as much money as Ukraine needs forever, presumably. There is only one problem with the BRICS bridge at the moment, though, which is that there is no shared BRICS currency. And they point out here that without a shared currency, most of the other members of BRICS are not very enthusiastic about it at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if they went into crypto, that would be pretty big.
If they did, but we'll see what happens. But again, speaking about foreign policy, the security, the intelligence and international state department of America are very worried about Trump and have been trying, because they basically knew that Trump was going to get in for a while, and they've been making active moves to try and Trump-proof Ukraine in the Ukraine war.
Because they want to continue the war and Trump wants to make peace, basically.
Yeah, because he has promised to end the war in Ukraine before he even takes office. I mean, that's quite the promise.
Yeah.
That's quite the promise. He's criticised US funding of Ukraine's war effort and called for Europe to assume more of the burden of supporting Kiev. He labelled Ukrainian President Zelensky the greatest salesman on earth, but he did added, doesn't mean I don't want to help him because I feel very bad for the Ukrainian people. Trump has claimed that it will take him just 24 hours to negotiate an end to the Russia-Ukraine war and that he will get it done before his inauguration in January. In a July 2023 interview with Fox News, he suggested that he would force Zelensky and Putin to the negotiating table by telling the Ukrainian leader that Kiev will get no more US aid and telling the Russian leader that Washington will dramatically increase aid to Kiev if a deal isn't made. So typical Trumpian bluster with this kind of thing. But it has been shown to be somewhat effective in the past. And also it does seem that Putin and Trump are more amenable to one another than Biden ever was towards Putin.
Also, it's worth mentioning that Putin wanted Biden to win at one point when he was the candidate. And it's also worth mentioning as well that Donald Trump won 3 Nobel Peace Prizes in the Middle East, I believe, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean...
Or at least some of them were.
It was under his administration that the Abraham Accords were signed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably a lot to do with that. J.D. Vance has expanded on it and said Trump would leave it to the two warring countries as well as Europe to work out the details of a peace agreement, but suggested that it would likely entail the establishment of a demilitarized zone along current battle lines, allowing Ukraine to retain its sovereignty while forcing it to give up some of its territory currently in Moscow's hands, as well as a guarantee that Ukraine will remain neutral, meaning it won't join NATO or other allied institutions, which was one of the big problems that set off the war in the first place.
That seemed like the most likely peace agreement for quite some time, to be honest.
I mean, again, outside of just going into a full-on ground war with Russia, mobilizing America and most of Europe as well, how are they going to win? How is Ukraine going to win? They've tried counter-offensive offensives that have failed. They've tried to reclaim territory. They've got little tiny bits here and there, but most of it has been Russia pushing west. Slowly, but surely. So, how are they going to do it? How are they going to do it without getting some kind of peace? Okay? Well, they fearmonger and then say, screw it. Screw it. Blast them. Just blast Russia. Why not? We've only got, only a few months until Trump gets in, and then he's probably going to end this war, so blast him. You know, like Frank.
I thought you were referencing that. I didn't want to lower the tone, but you did it for me.
Yeah, so November 17th, when American news outlets reported that Joe Biden had changed course and given Ukraine permission to use the advanced ATACMS, otherwise known as ATACMS, long-range missiles on Russian soil. That's how they describe them in the military. They are, I think they've got a range of 300 kilometers. Excuse me. So they'd previously had access to American and British missiles that they had fired into Russian territory and some into Russia itself. I think some had been fired into Russia back in June. But this is the new, they are the longest range missiles that they can fire directly into Russian territory now. So this is a worry. The decision, it says, will not dramatically change Ukraine's flagging fortunes on the front lines, though it will boost morale and strengthen the country's hand ahead of negotiations pursued by Donald Trump after January 20th. America first gave Ukraine HIMARS rocket launchers in the summer of 2022, although equipped only with short-range GPS-guided rockets in late 2023. After over a year of debate, it provided the 300-kilometer range ATACMS. Ukraine used the weapons to devastating effect in Russian-occupied territory, including Crimea, but was denied permission to fire them over the border into Russia against the airfields, ammunition depots, and command posts that were being used to strike it. Ukraine's frequently used its own drones and missiles to strike inside Russia, but ATACMS strikes typically require American assistance with intelligence and targeting. Vladimir Putin has said that the use of Western missiles in Russia would constitute direct involvement in the war. And as of yesterday, he has changed Russia's nuclear doctrine to accommodate for that. The doctrine now says that an attack from a non-nuclear state, Ukraine, if backed by a nuclear power, the US, will be treated as a joint assault on Russia.
So I think what Putin is doing here is trying to scare people off rather than actively considering a nuclear strike. Although this is a game of chicken where Western powers gain very little.
The consequences could be disastrous, but it is worth pointing out, as you are, that Putin has, for the past 2 years, been saying, cross this red line, we'll fire nukes. They cross the red line, nothing happens. Cross this red line, we'll fire nukes. They cross it again, nothing happens. Even some of the attacks into Crimea were supposedly a red line that would fire nukes, and nothing has happened.
Yeah, I mean, some rabid left-wingers might say that Putin is a madman, but I don't think that that's a fair characterization of him. Having listened to him speak, you might not agree with his rationales, but they're not that of a madman necessarily. And I think that he understands that if he launches nuclear weapons at the West, then Russia stands to be obliterated, and that is in no one's interest, and that it's very unlikely. But then again, it's one of those things where, do you really want to take that risk? Because, of course, the costs of being wrong here are massive. You won't be around very long to lament it, because you'll be vaporized.
That is true, but I think Putin knows that if he waits out just a little bit longer for Donald Trump, negotiations might actually get on the table, at which point he can take a bit of territory that he was after anyway. Ukraine stays out of NATO and we can go back to some kind of peace deal.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully nothing bad happens before then. I don't expect nuclear war.
No.
I don't expect nuclear war anytime soon, but there's always a very, very slim chance. So
I also would like to add as well, I really hope that this escalation doesn't result in more innocent people being killed.
Of course, more than anything, the amount of innocent people that have been killed, the amount of young people in Ukraine, male and female, who have either died or fled the country is an absolute disaster.
It's also worth mentioning as well that the Russian conscripts might not even agree with the war in the first place.
They don't have much of a choice.
No.
So we'll see what happens. I, as always, am hoping for peace.
Hi folks, thanks for watching. We really appreciate the fact that we are kept sustained by the fact that you guys sign up to lotuseats.com for £5 a month to help us actually allow to exist. Because of course we're demonetized here. So if you'd like to support us, go over to lotuseats.com and watch the latest episode in the incredibly deep dive that we are doing on Stanley Kubrick. This is episode 3, and it's not the end, as I understand. Also, go over to X, formerly Twitter, and follow us at lotuseaters_com.